Montreal. And she's going to talk to us about decolonizing epistemic power. Amandine, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Veli, Abe, and Caitlin for organizing this great conference and for having me as part of it. So let me start the presentation. Yeah, so just to start with the land acknowledgement, UQAM sits on land that is part of the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. We recognize and respect these nations, which never ceded their rights nor their sovereign authority over the lands and waters on which UQAM sits today. So to give a little bit of context for my talk today, so it will come as no surprise here that many Western democracies have been and continue to be involved in colonialism. But at the same time, whether we think of the cases of North America, Europe, or Australasia, colonial memory seems to be either distorted or lacking entirely. And that creates what I'm going to call colonial erasure. And colonial erasure, in turn, is going to create material and cultural forms of social injustice. And that's going to make it the case that the social justice claims of Afrodescendants, for example, are going to be dismissed or misunderstood. And so I'm going to show that we need colonial memory, among other things, to make these claims, to take these claims seriously. So my aim is to show how basically the lack of colonial memory is a problem of epistemic injustice that undermines political equality in contemporary societies. My idea here, more specifically, is that colonial erasure both creates inequalities in both epistemic and political power, and also undermines the democratic process of reason giving. So for my outline then, I'm going to start by talking about how colonial erasure creates epistemic injustice with regard to colonialism, then turn to how colonial erasure creates further epistemic injustice with regard to contemporary social justice claims by setting up what I call a meta-epistemic filter. And finally, I'll talk about how meta-epistemic filtering undermines political equality by interfering with reason giving. So let's start with the first point, then colonial erasure creates epistemic injustice with regard to colonialism. So when I talk about colonial erasure, I mean defective social memory with regard to colonialism. And that can take one of two forms. Either it's just inaccurate knowledge. So for example, the mistaken belief that colonialism is over, which is something that is often heard in North America, or maybe more likely to be heard in Europe, in countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, or France, that colonialism was some sort of golden age in the country's history. And then colonial erasure or defective social memory can also take the form of ignorance, where there is just no knowledge at all regarding colonialism. But either way, we'll see that in both those cases, colonial memory is severely distorted or lacking entirely. And so in particular, I want to stress the fact that it obscures the continuity between past and present injustice. Now, when I talk about social memory, I do want to stress that, and this is important, that it's not, in fact, shared by all members of society. So social memory is connected to social identity. And so what that means is that what's often perceived or presented as a society's collective memory is in fact the social or collective memory of the relevant dominant social group in that society. So I'm going to be using the example of Belgium and Belgium's colonial involvement, simply because that's where I'm from originally. So I feel most comfortable talking about that context. So in that context, we might think that there's the social memory regarding colonialism, that of white Belgians versus that of the Congolese diaspora, for example, and those are going to be different. But basically, this idea that there is a dominant group that sort of dictates what's commonly taken as the social memory of the colonial history, basically is going to affect representations in public space, discourse, and culture. And basically, again, just stressing how colonial erasure can yield both distortions and ignorance, or take the form of both distortions and ignorance. So here I'm just, as an example, giving the headline from a piece from the RTBF, basically drawing our attention to the fact that Belgian colonial history is sorely lacking in education curricula. And then here, just another series of symbols. So you have here this blackface tradition on the top left corner of St. Nicholas. So you can see, of course, like the huge symbolism of the tall, imposing white man, and then this sort of buffoonish kneeling figure of what's supposed to represent a Black person, but is actually a white person in blackface. In the middle here, you have the statue of King Leopold II, which now has writing that says like racism, and back here it says like BLM for Black Lives Matter, and you can see it's been splashed with red paint for to signify all the blood that he literally had on his hand. King Leopold II was the king who colonized the Congo. And so then on the top right corner here, you have this little vignette of this little thumbnail of another basically sort of expression that's used in the French language in Belgium that says tout ça ne nous rendra pas le Congo. So literally all of this will not give us back the Congo, with obviously the idea that the Congo belongs to Belgium and should rightly be given back to it. So that expression has come to mean, well, you know, whatever we've just been talking about, that doesn't really matter. That won't really solve like the actual problems we're dealing with. And so this expression is literally used in everyday language, and has, like I said, and this is here being used as the expression is being used in a national television and radio channel, the RTBF, which is like the equivalent of the BBC in the UK, and is using that as sort of like the name of one of their shows. And then of course you have the extremely racist representations of Tintin in the Congo, which are still nonetheless published with absolutely no warnings or contextualization, and is full of racism and racist representations. And then finally here in the bottom right corner, you have a street sign basically saying the name of the Boulevard Général Jacques, so General Jacques Boulevard in Brussels, which is tucked in, I always like to stress, between Montgomery Square and Franklin Roosevelt Avenue. And then in fact, when you find out who this person was, they were basically a general in the force publique. So the public force was the ruthless military force that Belgians imposed in the Congo, and among other many other things, they were notorious for the severed hand policy. So this is all to say that you have all these symbols in public space, discourse, and culture, whether it's in the form of blackface traditions and these statues and these, national TV or radio shows, and what's considered classic children's books, and whatever street you drive on every day. So just to say that it's very, very deeply ingrained in Belgian culture. So to say a little bit more about how colonial erasure then connects to epistemic injustice, basically, it creates epistemic injustice for minoritized groups like Afrodescendants and Indigenous peoples. Because of colonial erasure, which is, again, distortions or ignorance about colonialism, the situations, experiences, and perspectives of Afrodescendants or Indigenous peoples and their social justice claims are going to be both unduly dismissed, which is a case of testimonial justice, and unduly misunderstood, which is a case of hermeneutical injustice by dominant or more powerful groups. Now, as you will probably know, hermeneutical injustice occurs when a society's mainstream hermeneutical resources mostly reflect the perspective of dominant groups, and as a result, the situation, experience, or perspective of members of non-dominant groups remains collectively misunderstood due to a lack of adequate hermeneutical resources. So basically, we're going to have an undue intelligibility deficit because of the society's flawed hermeneutical resources or set of social representations. Now, colonial erasure, as I've said, is basically connected to this defective set of social representations about that society's colonial involvement. So this set of social representations is part of the society's hermeneutical resources. They are defective resources, but resources nonetheless that the society is going to draw on to describe and interpret the situation or experience of colonialism. And so this defectiveness is due to either, like I said, inaccurate representations or to an absence of accurate representation. So again, this idea that it's either in the form of distortions or ignorance. And so again, this defective set of social representations means that the situation, experience, or perspective of the colonized and their descendants will remain collectively misunderstood. So in other words, they will face a hermeneutical injustice in the sense that they will suffer an undue intelligibility deficit due to inadequate hermeneutical resources in the mainstream. And this idea that there's an undue intelligibility deficit can also stem from the fact that there's a lack of recognition of adequate understandings that are developed by marginalized groups, but they're not adequately adopted by dominant groups. So this has been variously theorized under different names. So Dodson will talk about contributory hermeneutical injustice, Pohlhaus about willful hermeneutical ignorance, and myself about hermeneutical domination. But in all of these cases, basically, this lack of recognition of adequate understandings is going to prevent Afro-descendants from contributing more accurate understandings of colonialism to the society's hermeneutical resources, which then is going to reinforce colonial erasure. So we're going to have this vicious circle between colonial erasure creating hermeneutical injustice and hermeneutical injustice maintaining colonial erasure. To turn now to testimonial injustice, it occurs when a hearer dismisses a speaker's testimony or epistemic contribution because of conscious or unconscious prejudice or negative stereotypes regarding the social identity of the speaker. And basically, we might say it's an undue credibility deficit because of social identity prejudice. So colonial erasure also involves testimonial injustice to the extent that it involves racist, stigmatizing representations or negative stereotypes of the colonized and their descendants. So it's going to create social identity prejudice. And what's interesting also is that this unduly deflated credibility judgment can take place either in an actual exchange, and that's the classic case of testimonial injustice, but it can also operate prior to a potential exchange, in which case it will preempt the potential exchange, and that's what Fricker calls preemptive testimonial injustice. And in this case, at hand here, it means that it will preempt the consultation or dismiss the input of Afro-descendants, which reinforces colonial erasure. So again, we have a vicious circle between colonial erasures producing stereotypes that are going to diminish the credibility of Afro-descendants, which means that in turn, they will not be taken seriously when they try to talk about colonialism, and that will maintain colonial erasure. So again, a vicious circle here. So turning now to the second part of the talk about how colonial erasure creates further epistemic injustice. I've just shown how it creates epistemic injustice with regard to colonialism, but now I want to show how it also creates further epistemic injustice with regard to contemporary social justice claims made by the colonized and their descendants by setting up what I call a meta-epistemic filter. So basically my idea here is that if we want epistemic justice, so if we want to grant intelligibility and credibility to the social justice claims of Afro-descendants and Indigenous peoples, this requires a prior understanding of the colonial past and its continued consequences into the present. But colonial erasure prevents exactly this kind of understanding. So in that sense, it predetermines the epistemic status both of a certain type of evidence, for example, regarding the colonial past and its ongoing effects, by making that kind of evidence unavailable. And it also predetermines the epistemic status of a certain type of claim, for example, contemporary claims of social justice, by rendering it inadmissible. And in this sense, colonial erasure sets up what I call a meta-epistemic filter. So let me say a little bit more. A meta-epistemic filter, as I understand it, provides a barrier to entry into the mainstream credibility and intelligibility economy by predetermining in a structurally biased way what kind of evidence or claims are made available or count as admissible or inadmissible in the first place. And this dynamic, I want to say, unfolds when the prior lack of accurate knowledge in the form of distortions or ignorance about colonialism, so the case of colonial erasure. So basically, when colonial erasure in the mainstream prevents the social justice claims voiced by Afrodescendants and Indigenous peoples from receiving uptake. And instead, in that case, colonial erasure sets up a meta-epistemic filter, namely a bias structure that makes it the case that their claims will be both misunderstood and discredited. So they will face, again, both hermeneutical and testimonial injustice. So let me now turn to the third and final part of the talk to show how this phenomenon that I've just described of meta-epistemic filtering undermines political equality by interfering with reason giving. So meta-epistemic filtering creates, again, further epistemic injustice by predetermining what appears as credible and intelligible. And at the same time, voicing demands of social justice requires being able to join the democratic process of political participation and reason giving as an equal. And of course, these demands, as we have seen, are typically unduly dismissed. In the case of that's a case of testimonial injustice, or unduly misunderstood, and that's a case of hermeneutical injustice, by dominant or more powerful groups because of colonial erasure, which creates meta-epistemic filtering and epistemic injustice. So meta-epistemic filtering is going to undermine political equality because it significantly hinders minorities' ability to engage in a democratic process of political participation on an equal basis. And basically, I also want to draw our attention to the fact that there is sort of, again, a vicious circle between the intelligibility and credibility deficits that are going to ensue here. So they're going to mutually reinforce each other, because the idea that I want to highlight here is that if social justice claims are unduly misunderstood, which is the hermeneutical aspect, then it's also likely that these claims will also be unduly discredited and dismissed, and that's the testimonial aspect. And conversely, if social justice claims keep being unduly dismissed, and that, again, this testimonial aspect, then it's very likely that these claims will remain unduly misunderstood, and that's the hermeneutical aspect. So again, a vicious circle between the testimonial and hermeneutical dimensions of the epistemic injustice and the meta-epistemic filtering, which basically here functions to undermine political equality. And indeed, there is a problem of political equality because if one is not adequately believed, so testimonial injustice, or not adequately understood, so hermeneutical injustice, due to upstream meta-epistemic filtering, then it's unlikely that one is going to be able to partake in public deliberation or address one's government or fellow citizens as an equal. So it's unlikely that one's argument will be heard and that the reasons one cites in support of one's arguments will receive uptake. And this is what I say, that colonial erasure in this way undermines the democratic process of reason giving. And securing epistemic justice and political equality, therefore, I think this shows us that it requires, among other things, a collective duty of colonial memory, which highlights the continuity between historical and contemporary injustice, and thereby renders present-day social justice claims intelligible and credible. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude then by summing up basically some of the main claims that I've made throughout the presentation. So the first is that colonial erasure affects representations in public space, discourses, and culture, and thereby creates hermeneutical and testimonial injustice with regard to beliefs and understandings of colonialism. Then I showed that colonial erasure sets up a meta-epistemic filter, which produces further epistemic injustice with regard to beliefs and understandings of social justice claims. I think that shows us that colonial erasure undermines political equality, and that in a sense, colonialism continues very much into the present also in this particular form. I think it also shows us that colonial memory is not just about the past, it's also importantly about the present and political equality and making certain claims intelligible and credible. And that colonial memory, in this sense, is required for both epistemic justice and political equality. And then just a final slide with the couple references that I cited, and also credits for the images that appeared on an earlier slide. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can move on to Q&A.